Greetings to all. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis for the lecture is consequences of the Russian Revolution. In this lecture, we shall explain important outcomes of the Russian Revolution. In this lecture, we shall discuss the consequences from short-term and long-term perspective. Further, this lecture shall also analyze significant work with respect to deeper understanding, critical analysis of the consequences of Russian Revolution. This lecture shall be of great use for the learners from the disciplines of history, political science, international relations, diplomatic issues, war and security studies, amongst others. The Russian Revolution, when we talk about it, and as we begin our lecture, the first thing that comes across our mind when we talk about Russian Revolution, that is, there were a series of revolutions of the early, somewhere, when you look at the time framework, early 20th century in Russia. The first revolution, when did it take place? The first revolution took place in Russia in 1905. Then what happens is this is followed by the Russian Revolution of 1917. With this, it is also very important to understand that when we look at the two levels of analysis of the Russian Revolution 1917, that is, in these two stages of analysis, the first is the revolution. In February, it overthrew the imperial government. And then the second revolution in October brings the Bolsheviks in power. So now with this our two-level analysis of how and when the Russian Revolution occurs, 1905, 1917, it becomes also essential to look at that how there was prevailing widespread discontent in Russia. Lenin overthrows Kerensky's government with the aim, with a very important aim, that is to establish a communist system in Russia. Further, when we look at Russian Revolution, one must also analyze not only the role of the Bolshevik party, but also the role of Revolutionary Red Guard. And yes, Russia was declared as a communist nation later. Herein, it becomes essential to analyze issues concerning the Russian Revolution. We must understand that the Russian Revolution of 1905, also known as the First Russian Revolution, happens in the backdrop of wave of mass political and social unrest. The consequences of the first Russian Revolution, that is, Tsar Nicholas II enacted constitutional reforms. Herein, one must study the October Manifesto. The Tsar Nicholas II promoted the establishment of the State Duma. So, establishing the State Duma, the multi-party system, and the Russian Constitution of 1906 were important consequences, outcomes of the Russian Revolution 1905. But however, there were several issues therein, that despite popular participation in the Duma, the parliament was unable to issue laws of its own. The power of the State Duma too was limited. So what happens here is, with time, with respect to the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, the Russo-Japanese War, Russian entry into the First World War, massive protests and riots at home, with the February Revolution, there is abdication of the Tsar, there is end of autocratic rule in Russia, provisional government is established, reforms are introduced, but with the reforms also being introduced, Russia continues to fight in the First World War. With time, there was massive people's dissatisfaction with the Tsarist imperial government. There was growing dissatisfaction amongst the peasants, the workers, the soldiers, and there was disintegration of the imperial Russian army. So therefore, one finds that in October, the Bolshevik party seizes the power in the capital of Russia, and Bolshevik party with time then leads to the establishment of Soviet Union in 1922. Herein, it becomes essential to look at the consequences. We just understood that the Russian Revolution needs to be understood in two stages. The first revolution in February overthrew the imperial government. The second revolution in October got the Bolsheviks in power. And then there is prevailing widespread discontent in Russia. Lenin leads and there is overthrow of Kerensky's government, and very important to look at the role of Revolutionary Red Guard, and Russia is declared as a communist country. Herein, let's now look at the consequences, and consequences once again we are bifurcating into two levels again: short-term consequences and long-term consequences. When we understand short-term consequences, it becomes essential to understand that Russia becomes a communist country. Farmlands were distributed amongst the farmers. Factories were given to workers. Going by some very important historical accounts that we read, that banks were nationalized. There was National Council to run the country's economy. And Russia pulls out of the First World War, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that gave land to Germany. Now with this, let's come towards the long-term consequences, and the long-term consequences are also related to the short-term consequences. The Russian Civil War between the Bolsheviks, the Reds, that we popularly called as, once again going by all the inputs that we have got, they are from credible historical resources, and the Whites. So the Reds, the Bolshevik, and the Whites, the anti-Bolsheviks. And this occurs, again going by inputs from various historical textbooks, 1918 and 1920. Then there are many people, that's very important to understand, that when we go by the world history data, approximately 15 million people died due to conflict and famine. And at this time, one must also see that there are churnings in the internal polity, and there is rise of Stalin in Soviet Union. The use of Gulag, prison camps for criminal and political prisoners, also gets worldwide attention. There are huge debates with respect to the ethical and the morality with respect to the use of Gulag as a coercive camp, a prison camp for the criminals and the political prisoners. The Russian Revolution is also connected when we try to understand its consequences. The consequences have a bearing on the Cold War also. What we see here is that we all know that Cold War, it was never an actual war between the then USSR and United States of America. It was more a battle of ideologies. There was no actual war with respect to arms and ammunitions, but propaganda, fear, and mistrust of the other were important issues driving the Cold War. And in this ideological war, the world being bifurcated into two blocks, the capitalist bloc led by United States of America and the communist bloc led by the then USSR. So between the Western world and the communist world that was led by the Soviet Union, the Cold War was a continuous state of political and military tensions between the two worlds. And there are important historical works, there are historians that opine that the Cold War can be said that when we talk about Cold War, the Russian Revolution with the rise of communism in Russia, with Russia becoming, as we just discussed, the first communist country, with that prepares the background. That gives an important fuel for the Cold War that happens at the end of the moment the Second World War finishes. Few years down the line, the two superpowers are drawn into an ideological clash and Cold War, a continuous state of political and military tension between the two worlds, that therefore can be attributed, as various historians say, that it was a Russian Revolution that prepared the consequences, the long-term consequences of the Russian Revolution, then prepared the background for the Cold War. The outcome of the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution that we often call it as, it was not only about change of power, but it was about overthrow of power, overthrow of anti-people's power, autocracy, destruction of aristocracy. The Bolshevik Revolution needs to be understood that the change of power was brought in by as a continuation of the massive discontentment, massive unrest that was there with the February Revolution. Building on there, the Bolshevik Revolution leads to changes in the power dynamics. There is overthrow of autocracy, destruction of aristocracy. And yes, as discussed, that with the establishment of the communist state, with the rise of communism in Russia, one also sees that the idea of communism then, just from being an idea, is then translated into reality. Now, this translation from an idea to reality, namely of the phenomena, the political doctrine, the ideology of communism, not only has a bearing for the internal dynamics of Russia, but as we just discussed also, for international relations, with respect to issues concerning the economic models to be followed, and above all with respect to the bigger questions of morality, namely to have a just polity wherein the state works in a manner that there is no economic discrimination, and to ensure that issues concerning private property, issues concerning more radical reallocation of resources towards the people who actually needed to ameliorate their lot. The Russian Revolution, when we look at the long-term consequences, was carrying some very powerful message too. And this powerful message of people's voice leading the march, people's concerns being forward with respect to issues concerning the polity, inspired workers, it inspired peasants. The socialist communist parties then also, when we look at the various significant examples from history all over Europe as well as in other countries, there was rise of the socialist communist parties. Now, with the rise of communism, with the establishment of the first communist state, also then, as we just discussed, that this impact, this long-term consequence was not just related to history. It cannot be just understood from a historical and a political lens, but also when we look at the dynamics of the economic apparatus, the rise and the establishment of the first communist state definitely presents to an important issue, that is emergence of an alternative model. And this alternative model needs to be contrasted with respect to that of a capitalist model. The entire Cold War, as we just discussed, the period of mistrust and suspicion based on fear and propaganda, was a battleground of ideologies. And the two important ideologies competing with each other were communism and capitalism. So, when we understand the long-term consequences of the Russian Revolution, one must understand that emergence of the alternative model of communism as an alternative to the capitalist model was just not about the internal dynamics of Russia, but it had a huge bearing on international relations and also as an alternative model for national economies and redistribution of resources with respect to the fiscal and other policies. Then it also had an impact on international relations. We just discussed that the Cold War, it is often argued by historians that the long-term consequences of Russian Revolution definitely needs to be seen as preparing the background, the framework for the Cold War. But also with respect to understanding international relations, one must understand that Western democracies were forced to pursue a softer policy towards Germany, towards Italy, because revival of Germany and Italy was considered very significant by the Western democracies to counter the spread of communism. The Bolshevik Revolution further, when we look at the long-term consequences, inspired similar communist movements in many parts of the world. There are a lot of references in world history that speak about how the Bolshevik Revolution was a very inspirational example for other communist movements in other parts of the world. Further, the long-term consequence of Bolshevik Revolution needs to be seen with respect to issue of socialism also. Socialism, namely that the idea of state playing an active role in regulating the economy and planning the economy to improve the condition of the people. The popularity of socialism also helped to mitigate, therefore, issues concerning discrimination on race, discrimination based on color. And this was also one of the appealing factor with respect to socialism and communism thereof as ideologies. So, with respect to the state role in the national economy, the state playing an active role in regulating the economy, planning the economy to improve the condition of the people, to reach out to people with welfare schemes, therefore then comes under scanner. It becomes an important issue with respect to policy making apparatus of several nation states. So it has become essential to understand that long-term consequence of the Bolshevik Revolution further need not be just seen with respect to the internal dynamics, with respect to international relations, with respect to inspiring communist movement, but also that how it also somewhere brings a revamp, a new idea with respect to state role in the economy, with respect to the significant overarching welfare role of the state. The Russian Revolution, as we just discussed, that there was a period of political and social revolution that took place in the former Russian Empire. Further, when we understand the Russian Revolution, that is one of the most significant events of the 20th century that ended centuries of monarchy in Russia and brought forth the first constitutionally communist state in the world. Herein, let's now take the discussion forward and let's try to understand the consequences of the Russian Revolution, the debates thereof, from the work of several academics, from the work of theorists from the domain of international relations, historians, political scientists, amongst others. We take reference to understand the consequences of Russian Revolution to the work of Jack A. Goldstone, Revolutions of Very Short Introduction. Now, this book is not written specifically with reference to the Russian Revolution, but the work of Jack A. Goldstone is very important to have a general framework with respect to understanding the revolutions, and then also use the arguments presented by Jack A. Goldstone, the insights from the work, to comprehend Russian Revolution and its consequences better. Now, revolutions are often driven by the idea of justice. The need to have justice, the need to be in the pursuit of social justice are important hallmarks of revolutions. Now, it's also then it becomes important to understand the strengths, the weaknesses, the failures of the revolutionaries. And this is why revolutions, when we look at the academic domain, when we look at several research inputs, revolutions continue to be significant case studies. So the intersection, important idea that we get from Jack A. Goldstone's work, that revolutions need to be seen a bigger picture. That is, intersection between the revolution and shifting patterns of global power. Also, one must look at deeper insights, that is, examination of the reasons for diverse revolutionary outcomes. From democracy in some places, revolutions often lead to civil war in some places. Revolutions also lead to authoritarian rule in some places. So therefore, this is the important sense, that is, intersections between revolutions and shifting patterns of global power, looking at the diverse revolutionary outcomes, the issue of pursuit of social justice. All these factors, all these insights and inputs are equally significant while we understand the consequences of the Russian Revolution. Another important work by George W. Breslauer. The work of George W. Breslauer, The Rise and Demise of World Communism. In this work, it is very important to understand that 16 states came to be ruled by communist parties when we look at the time framework of 20th century. Soviet Union was geographically the largest nation in the world and a superpower. So therefore, the work, The Rise and the Demise of World Communism, presents important insights, and that is, regimes all came to power in the context of warfare or its aftermath. The work, The Rise and Demise of World Communism, gives an important perspective, that is, this rise of regime in the context of warfare or revolution is followed by consolidation of power by a revolutionary elite that values revolutionary violence as the preferred means to end. And this can be also seen that Marx's vision of revolution, Lenin's conception of party organization too, are based on this aspect. So therefore, the work by George W. Breslauer, The Rise and Demise of World Communism, herein the author then explores the relations amongst the communist states as well as relations between those states and of world increasingly affluent, military formidable, democratic, capitalist powers. So therefore, the very need for diversity, differences, led to the collapse of European communism. Few communist regimes still remain in power, but however, the important insight that one gets from the work, The Rise and Demise of World Communism, especially when we are looking at the consequences, the long-term consequences of Russian Revolution, that the dream of world communism somewhere looks bleak. The future of the remaining communist regime somewhere, again reading through the important insights from George W. Breslauer's work, The Rise and Demise of the World Communism, the future of the remaining communist regime somewhere looks uncertain. Another important work as we look into the causes or the consequences of the Russian Revolution, the work by Jean Semele, Anthony Haywood, The Russian Revolution of 1905, Centenary Perspectives. Now this work is very important because it is by the study group on Russian Revolution Conference. This work reviews, it presents an important reassessment of the understanding of what actually happened in 1905. 2005, the year then, marked the centenary of the first Russian Revolution. So therefore, there was rejection of the Tsarist rule, there was waves of strikes, urban uprising, peasants' revolts, national revolutions across the Russian Empire, and herein this was a crucial turning point with respect to demise of the autocracy. It led to rise of revolutionary socialism, and this book definitely is very significant because it gives us fresh insights, important new research on the role of individuals, the social groups, the political parties and institutions. Another important work that is by Aaron B. Retish and Matthew Rendell, that is the global impact of the Russian Revolution. Herein, the work tells us that the revolution influenced the political movements across the world, and herein there are some important case studies from Latin America, from East Asia. So we must look into the arguments of the book while understanding consequences of the Russian Revolution. Last work that we'll take into account, the work by Laura Engenstein, Russia in Flame, War, Revolution, Civil War, 1914 to 1921. The year is very significant, 1914 to 1921. This work, Russia in Flames, asks the questions, what actually happened during these 7 years? And this is very important to ask to comprehend the consequences in a better manner. October 1917 is seen as the culmination of the Russian Revolution, and yes, even many years after that, emergence of the world's first self-proclaimed socialist states, there are important debates therein. 7 years, there is revolutionary upheaval, the civil strife. It is important to look at the issue of ruthless suppression of the opposition. It is important to look at the implosion of the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty. It is also very important to look at the struggle for power engaged, that is not only the civil society and the party leaders, but the broad masses of the population. And above all, this new narrative of the Russian Revolution and world civil war is essential to look at the social breakdown somewhere being used as an important cause, an important consequence by the Bolsheviks to harness new world order. So therefore, dear learners, we hope that the lecture on understanding the consequences of the Russian Revolution presented to you significant insights, ideas and perspectives from various academic work to understand the topic better. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all for the lecture Understanding Consequences of the Russian Revolution. Thank you very much.